right, welcome back for Lab 8, the final lab of the semester. So we're almost there. This last lab is no muscles, as you're probably aware, but is just the axial skeleton. So we've got the bones that make up the skull, and in addition to that, we have the vertebral column, so the spine, and then some of the landmarks on the different vertebrae, and then the sternum, and then the ribs. So not too bad this week. So we're going to start here with the bones of the skull. So I should say at the outset, so obviously these are the essential anatomy pictures, which are fairly easy to see, but there is a pretty good netter diagram that's on the slideshow that's posted in Canvas. So all of the bones are different colors, and if you actually run it as a slideshow, there's arrows that point to each bone, and it tells you the color and all that stuff. So for some of these, including the ethmoid bone here, the first bone, I think in some ways it's actually easier to see on the netter diagram that's included in the slideshow. But nonetheless, we'll do it with the Essential Anatomy app pictures. So we'll start here with the ethmoid bone. So obviously the one that I'm going to be talking about on every slide is going to be the one that's in green. And so you can see the ethmoid bone. We're going to start with a semi-difficult one because the septum that divides the left and right side of your sinuses is actually comprised of two bones, and the first of them is the ethmoid. And so the ethmoid actually makes up the top part of that septum, which I'm mousing over right there, as well as part of the roof of the sinuses, and then you can see part of the medial aspect of the eye socket there. And if I switch to a slightly different view, so kind of a 3/4 view here in a second, maybe. Go this way. Maybe this will work. There we go. All right, so now we switch to 3/4 view. Sorry about that. So you can see again, it's that top part of the septum, and then right there, that medial aspect of the eye socket. So what you care about is, if I was going to ask you about the ethmoid bone, I would put a sticker on the top part of the septum, dividing the sinuses into left and right. So the sticker would kind of be up in this area. I wouldn't ask you on the inside of the eye socket. So the sticker will be here. So that's your ethmoid bone. And then the next one is a much easier bone, and that's your frontal bone. So you can see the frontal bone there. So remember, the frontal lobe of your cerebral cortex is in the front. It's on the anterior aspect, and so that makes it pretty easy because all of those lobes that we talked about with the brain, between the frontal lobe, parietal, temporal, and occipital, so 4 of the 5 that we talked about, they sit underneath a bone of the same name. So the frontal lobe of the brain sits underneath the frontal bone, so it's a pretty big bone, and you can see it there. So one of the things I would draw your attention to early on are these little squiggly lines here. So these are called sutures, and so those are the end of one bone and the start of another one. So that is technically a joint because you've got bone-to-bone interaction there, but obviously that's an immovable joint. We don't want that moving around. But nonetheless, those sutures are pretty obvious on the skull, and you'll see that when we get to class. So it'll be pretty easy to tell which of the bones that I'm talking about. And then the other thing is, when I put stickers on them in the lab, I'll try to put it like dead center in the middle of this bone, so there won't be any question about which one I'm referring to. So at any rate, this is the frontal there. And then we'll switch to the posterior aspect of the skull. So then the occipital bone is back here. In the occipital bone, there's typically a pretty big knob, and the skulls in class have this too. You can feel that at the base of your skull, so it's a pretty obvious little knob right there. So again, the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex underlies that. So that's your occipital bone, and again, like I said, the sutures here are pretty obvious, and you can see the suture there between the occipital bone and the parietal bone. Speaking of the parietal bone, so the parietal bone is on the superior aspect of the skull, kind of a superior posterior, and then there's a right and a left parietal bone. You won't have to identify sides or anything like that, just know that the bone is the parietal bone. Obviously in the skull, sides are pretty easy, but nonetheless, I won't ask you about side. It's either you know it's the parietal bone or you don't. So kind of like we talked about with the tarsal bones, where either you know it's the calcaneus or not, and so those are 5 points, kind of an all or nothing type of a question. So that's the parietal bone. Then next we've got the sphenoid bone, and the sphenoid bone is kind of the most oddly shaped of the bones of the skull. It looks pretty straightforward there. The sphenoid sits in the junction between, so you've got the frontal bone here that we already talked about, the parietal bone that we just talked about, and then one that we haven't, which is the temporal bone. So the sphenoid sits kind of between those three. So it also encompasses part of the sinuses and part of the eye socket. So if I switch views, so you can see all of this is the sphenoid bone, so that kind of posterolateral aspect of the eye socket, and then you can see it back here on the posterior aspect of the sinuses, and you can even see part of it back here. So if I'm going to ask you about that bone, I'll ask you over here, because I think that's the most obvious area where you can find that bone. When I try to put like stickers inside of the sinuses, that makes things pretty complicated. So if I want to ask you about the sphenoid, I'm going to put the sticker over here. So if you find a sticker between the frontal, parietal, and temporal bones in this spot, then that's the sphenoid. Speaking of the temporal bone, so that's next. So there's your temporal bone. And you can see the opening there for your ear, yeah, we'll leave it at that. We won't get too technical here. So anyway, so this is the temporal bone. And so remember that the temporal area of the cerebral cortex is responsible for the perception of sound, which you can tell that makes sense there. So anyway, temporal bone is there on the lateral, or really inferolateral aspect of the skull. And then we go from the temporal bone to the lacrimal bone, which is this tiny little bone right there. And I'll show you how to find it on the skulls in class, but it's not too bad. So if it helps, and this is how I remember the lacrimal bone, is that your tear ducts are called your lacrimal ducts. And so as you'll see when we get to the skulls in class, this tiny little lacrimal bone, there's a hole right here. So as you are probably aware, if you cry, then you start to have a runny nose, and so you'll be able to see the little hole where the tears from your tear ducts actually go down into your sinuses. So that is there. Then if we go down lower here, your lower jaw, that is your mandible. So the mandible is there. So again, lower jaw. And then your upper jaw is the next one. Whoop, so there's the front view of the mandible. Then your upper jaw is your maxilla, and as you can see there is technically a left and a right maxilla. Again, I won't ask you for sides, but the maxilla is the bone into which your top or upper teeth insert. So that's it. Then we got the nasal bone. So the nasal bone sits at the very top of the nose. Most of your external nose is cartilage, but not all of it. So the nasal bone gives rise to that, so that cartilage would obviously be in here. But the nasal bone, again, there's a right and a left. I won't ask you for sides, but that's the right nasal bone right there. Next one, we have to look inside of the mouth. So you're going to get an inferior view of the skull right there, and that's the Palatine Bone, or Palatine Bone, however you want to pronounce that. So that forms your hard palate, or part of it. And so basically it is this posterior aspect of the roof of your mouth, is one way to think about it. So this up here, so this is still your maxilla right there. And then you're going to see when we get to the skulls in class, there's a pretty obvious little suture right through there. And then there's a really small bone that lines the back of the roof of the mouth, or the posterior aspect of the roof of the mouth, and that's the Palatine Bone, or Palatine Bone. So that's it. And then the vomer, we'll stick with the same view. So remember I said that there's two bones that make up that septum that divides your sinuses into left and right. The first one is the ethmoid bone, which is the very first bone that we talked about, that forms the top part of that septum. And then the second one here is the vomer. And so the vomer forms both the posterior and inferior aspect of that septum. So there's the vomer from the posterior aspect, there's the vomer from kind of a 3/4 view on the anterior aspect. So again, thinking about that ethmoid bone that we already talked about, that's it right here, and then the vomer is down here. So from a practical standpoint, if I was going to put a sticker on that, I would put it on the posterior aspect, because all of this is the vomer, and so the most obvious spot where I could put that, and I wouldn't be asking you about any of the other bones, would be right there in the middle on the posterior aspect. Then we got our zygomatic bone. So the zygomatic bone is one that makes up most of the arch of your cheek, and it's actually going to run into the temporal bone. So I'm going to go back a few slides to the temporal bone. There's our temporal bone. So all of this in front of that is the zygomatic bone. So you've got zygomatic bone from this suture, because this is the frontal bone up here. So below the suture, or inferior to it, so this is the zygomatic bone, going all the way back to here till we hit this suture. Now if we move behind that or posterior to that, now we're onto the temporal bone. But again, most of this is the arch of the cheek, and then if we go too far anterior, so you can see another little suture right here, everything in front of that is the maxilla. So the zygomatic bone is right here, again makes up most of your cheek. So then moving on, so there's zygomatic, and then our very last one on the skull is the foramen magnum, and you can see my arrow pointing at it. So foramen magnum means big hole, and so that's the big hole at the base of the skull that your brainstem and spinal cord exit through. All right, so then we move on to the vertebral column. So we've talked about the spine in class some. Remember that there's 3 sections to the spine. There's the cervical section, which is the most superior section, so that's your neck. So the cervical section is your neck. Then there's the thoracic section, which are the vertebrae that interact with ribs. So that makes up your thorax or your chest cavity. And then there are the lumbar vertebrae, which make up your low back. So there's 7 bones in the cervical section, so 7 bones in the neck, 12 bones in the thoracic section, and then 5 in the lumbar section. So the way people are typically told to remember that is that you eat breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. So again, 7 bones in the cervical section, that's where that comes from, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. So what you're looking at here is a lumbar vertebrae from the anterior aspect, so it's a front view or anterior view of a lumbar vertebrae. So I'm going to switch views a little bit. So there's a side view, there's a 3/4 view, posterior aspect. There we go. So that is a superior view, so looking down from the top on our lumbar vertebrae, because that makes our very first landmark easier to spot, and that is the body. So most of the vertebrae is comprised of the body. So all of this round area on the anterior aspect or on the front of the bone, that's the body of the vertebrae. So your intervertebral discs sit atop those bodies. So you'd have body, disc, and then the adjacent vertebrae right on top of the disc. So that's the body. And then we move posteriorly from the body to the pedicle. So the pedicle, there are 2 of them. So one of them is right here, and then the other one is right here. So pedicle kind of sounds like pedestal. And so what those are posterior projections from the body that help open up some space for this area. So that's the vertebral foramen. So the pedicles help open up some space for that. So there's a right pedicle, because this is on the individual's right side, and then there's a left pedicle on the individual's left side there. And then the pedicles run straight into the lamina. So this part of the vertebrae that's angled at about 45 degrees right here is the lamina. So again, this is the right lamina, and then now we're on the left lamina. So again, the area that's angled at about 45 degrees. So if we go from the body, we go body here, pedicle on the right side through here, straight into the lamina. So again, this is the right lamina, straight into the left, and then left pedicle. And so all of that then between pedicle, lamina, lamina, and pedicle comprises the neural arch. And so the neural arch, its job is to protect the spinal cord, which is going to sit here in that vertebral foramen. So we got the pedicle, we got the lamina, now we're on to the spinous process. So the spinous process is a projection that pokes straight posteriorly. So this is the spinous process right here. So each vertebrae only has one. Those are the little knobs that you can feel on the posterior aspect of your spine. You feel little, like I said, bony knobs, especially if you flex the neck. You can feel them at the base of the neck. Those are the spinous processes. Then we got the transverse processes, so those go out to the side. So there is a right transverse process over here, and then a left transverse process over here. So between any of those processes, there are ligaments that run between the transverse process of one vertebrae and then the ones above and below. And then there are also ligaments that run between the spinous processes and the vertebrae above and below, as well as muscles between the transverse processes and muscles between the spinous processes. So, got those. And then, let's see. So let's talk about the articular process and facets. I'm actually going to switch to a side view for this. So the superior articular process is this, and then the facet is the articular surface, so kind of that lighter colored surface here, so that's that hyaline cartilage. So the superior articular process is here, the superior articular facet is here, and then if we look down on the inferior aspect, there's an inferior articular process down here, and then switch views, inferior articular facet is right here. So you don't need to know the difference between the two. If you just call it the superior articular process, that would be fine, or the inferior articular process, that would also be fine. The reason those are there is because this vertebrae is going to interact with a vertebrae above it. So the inferior articular process of the vertebrae that would be above it would interact with this superior articular process and facet. So you'd have a right side here, left side here. So, and by the same token, these inferior articular processes and facets are going to interact with the superior articular process and facet of the vertebrae below. So they form an interlocking set of actual synovial joints. So the interaction between this superior articular process and facet and the inferior one of the vertebrae above, they form a synovial joint, so you're actually going to have a joint capsule, which is well innervated, so that helps us be aware of our position sense in our back. And so those are the true bone-to-bone connections in the spine, as opposed to with the intervertebral discs. So obviously there's a disc between each of the vertebral bodies, so those aren't true bone-to-bone connections. Those aren't true joints. They're called cartilaginous joints, but they're not like the synovial joint that we see in the facets. So there's the superior and inferior articular processes and facets. We talked about the vertebral foramen. So again, that's the whole. Skipping ahead, there we go. So the vertebral foramen is the hole that your spinal cord sits in, so that's there. And then the next three things, or the last three things, are special features that we only see in the thoracic section of the spine, or that we only see in the cervical section of the spine. So again, this is a lumbar vertebrae. This is one in the low back. One of the features of the lumbar vertebrae is that they have a really big body relative to the other vertebrae. So big bodies, they are big bones. The other thing is that they tend to have a fairly short spinous process. So if you look at it from the side, it does point down a little bit, but it's not a really steep angulation. So again, fairly short spinous process there. Their superior and inferior articular processes and facets are almost pointed toward the midline, and the reason that matters is that changes the amount of motion that we get in the spine in that section. So basically the lumbar section of the spine, because of the position of the facets, we don't really get much rotation, so you don't get a whole lot of left and right rotation, but we do get quite a bit of flexion extension. So you can really bend forward and really lean backwards in the low back, but you don't get a whole lot of rotation in the low back. Most of the rotation in the spine comes from the thoracic section. Like if you're thinking about sporting movements, like swinging a bat or something of that nature, throwing a ball, etc. Most of that rotational motion actually comes from the thoracic section of the spine, because those facets in the thoracic section basically point straight back. So you get lots of rotation, but there you don't get as much flexion or extension, and I'll show you why. So that's a cervical vertebrae. So here's our thoracic vertebrae. So I am actually skipping the transverse foramen for a second to show you the thoracic section. So again, this is a thoracic vertebrae. So the thoracic section is the middle section of the spine. Those are the vertebrae that interact with the ribs. So I'm going to show you the superior costal facet. Remember that anything costal means rib. So the superior costal facet is this little articular surface right here. And they're somewhat difficult to find on the bones in class. The inferior ones are typically pretty easy to find, depending on which particular bone you're looking at. But there's just a little indentation right there at the posterior aspect of the body. That's the that's the inferior costal facet right there. So that one's inferior costal facet. And then this one is the superior costal facet. So the important thing to know, or one of the important things to know about them, is those are only found in the thoracic section, because again, those are going to interact with the ribs, and so you only find those in the section where the ribs are. The other thing I would point out here is the spinous process, how long and pointy they are, and how steep their angulation is. So because of that steep angulation, there's quite a bit of overlap between this and the vertebrae below it. And so you don't get a whole lot of extension in the thoracic spine because of the shape of those spinous processes. So one of the things I will ask you to do is to be able to determine which section of the spinal column, whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, a particular vertebrae comes from. So one way to do that is to look at the spinous process. And so if the spinous process is pretty long and angled, and it's kind of sharp and angled fairly steeply, well then that's a thoracic vertebrae. Same kind of thing if it has costal facets, right? Then that has to be a thoracic vertebrae. The other thing I would tell you as far as superior inferior is when you get to the lab, you'll see that I have individual little bones. And so what you'll have to do is to be able to identify which way is up in your vertebrae. So the way to do that is to look at the spinous process here. The spinous process has to angle down. So if you're holding a vertebrae and the spinous process is angled up, then you're holding it upside down. So make sure the spinous process is angled down. All right, so then we're going to back up a little bit. So now what you're looking at is a cervical vertebrae from the superior aspect. So it's a view from the top of your cervical vertebrae. So now I'm going to show you the transverse foramen, which is the third row from the bottom if you're looking at your lab sheet. So the transverse is out to the side. So transverse foramen is a hole out to the side. So there's two of those. So there's one here, and then there's one here. And so there's an artery that runs on either side of that. So that's why those holes are there. So in the cervical section, that transverse foramen, that's a distinguishing feature of the cervical vertebrae. Only the cervical section is going to have that transverse foramen. So if you're holding a vertebrae and it has those holes on either side of it, well then you know that that vertebrae belongs to the cervical section. The other thing is that the spinous processes in the cervical section have this kind of Y shape there as well. There's a ligament that falls into that. So that's different too, in that the spinous processes of the thoracic and lumbar section don't have that shape. They're basically just, they come to a point and that's it. So, and then the lumbar ones are the largest of them. Again, they're going to have a fairly short and basically kind of flat spinous process. So it'll become pretty easy to figure out which one's the lumbar vertebrae. So those are the vertebrae. Then on to the ribs. The good news with the ribs is that you don't have to identify sides, so you won't have to know right or left or anything like that. All you have to do is to be able to identify the landmarks, and then the double good thing is that there are not a whole lot of landmarks on the ribs. So the first one is the angle. So I should actually tell you, just to orient yourself, you're looking at a right rib from the anterior view. So I've taken away everything other than this right rib. So the spine would be back here, where I'm mousing up and down. So the spine would be here, and then the costal cartilage would be over here, and then the sternum would be in the middle. So this is the posterior aspect back here. This is the anterior aspect up here. All right, and so the first landmark is actually kind of between the two, but it's more posterolateral. So the first landmark is the angle of the rib, which is right here where I'm mousing over. There's a pretty pronounced angle on a lot of the ribs. And so if I intend to ask you about the angle, I'll pick one that has a really obvious one. So the angle is right here. And it's even, the drawing that's up in the slideshow is probably a little bit better. So it might be worth your time to make sure you pull up that PowerPoint and then look at all the landmarks on the rib, because I think they're clearer on that. But at any rate, so the angle is there. There we go, got the mouse back. So the angle is right there. And then the next thing is the costal end. So the costal end is here. So it's basically the anterior end of the rib, and it's going to interact with the costal cartilage. So all of this, then the really flat end without any features, that's the costal end of the rib. Then we're going to go back to the posterior aspect. So the head is what's going to sit up against the vertebrae directly. So the head is there. And then when you got a head, you got a neck. So the narrow area there is the neck. And then the last landmark is the tubercle, which is this thing right here. So the tubercle is going to interact with that transverse process on the thoracic vertebrae. So if we go back, there we go. See this little facet there, this little indentation? So that's obviously an articular surface. So that then is going to interact with the tubercle of the rib. So the head of the rib will interact here with the body of the vertebrae, and then the tubercle of the rib will interact here with the transverse process of the vertebrae. And then I got one more view for you. So this is the medial view of the rib. So now you're looking at the right rib, looking out basically as if you were on the left side. So then you can see pretty obviously the head of the rib is right there, and then the tubercle is there, and then the angle is over here. And as I said, check out the PowerPoint that's up. It'll be a little bit more obvious where all of those things are. Then last, we have our sternum. Sternum's pretty straightforward. So with the sternum, so there's three parts to it. So there's the body of the sternum, there's the manubrium, and then there's the xiphoid. So what is highlighted here is the body of the sternum. So the body is the middle part of the sternum. So it's all of this in the middle. So that's the body. Then we go to the manubrium. So the manubrium is the top of the sternum, and there's a really obvious line that's going to divide those two, so don't worry about whether or not you'll be able to tell. You will. It's a pretty obvious line there. So anyway, all of this is the manubrium, and the manubrium has the features that are included, so some of the landmarks. So there are two sets of notches on there. So there's the clavicular notch, which is the second row down on the lab sheet. So the clavicular notch, so you remember way back to that first lab, your clavicles are your collarbones. And so there's an indentation on the right, and then another indentation on the left. So you have a right clavicular notch and a left clavicular notch. So those are the indentations on either side of the manubrium. And so those, the interaction between the clavicle and the manubrium, forms the sternoclavicular joint, or the SC joint. So remember, that's one of the joints of the shoulder girdle. So we've come full circle now from the first lab to the last, and so we see the sternoclavicular joint again here. So the interaction between the clavicle and that clavicular notch. Then the last one on there is as far as the notches go, is the jugular notch. So that's this indentation right there. So it's between the clavicles, and it's a pretty obvious indentation or drop off right there in the middle of the manubrium. So there's your jugular notch. And then moving on to our costal cartilage, which is the third row down on the lab sheet. So I had to put the connective tissue on there to be able to get the costal cartilage, but so the green things there, those are the costal cartilage. So there's no true bone-to-bone connection between the costal end of the rib and the sternum. There is cartilage that sits between the two, and so that is your costal cartilage right there. So all those little green things there are the costal cartilage. On the sets that I have in lab, the sternums all have costal cartilage attached to them, and it's kind of this like tannish yellow semi-transparent plastic. So it becomes really obvious what the costal cartilage is as opposed to what the sternum is. And then the very last thing is the xiphoid. So the xiphoid is the most inferior aspect of the sternum. It's this little point down here at the bottom. So pretty small. It's not quite as small on the ones in lab. But again, it's kind of this little pointy thing down there. If you've taken a CPR class, at some point they probably told you to make sure that you put your hands high enough on the sternum when you're doing CPR so that you avoid the xiphoid. So that's it down there, because potentially if you started doing chest compressions on that thing, you'd cause it to fracture, and that would be bad. So anyway, you've probably heard of it if you've taken a CPR class, which I'm sure most of you had. So those are all the bones that we're going to cover this week, and that we're going to cover in lab for the entire semester. So we'll see you in lab this week, and we'll talk about those specific bones, and I'll show you how to find all of those things on the skull.